Come here, O man. Come here to me, O man. This way. Come to me. Now. Come here. Man, look at the world. Look at the hunger. Look there. Oppression.
Oh, I didn't know I had so much company. Well, you'll have to get your own tea. I suppose you want a story. Everybody does. Well, that's all right. I've got one. Yes. Once upon a time, there was a great king who loved children of any age. He lived at the top of a solid stone mountain that none but his son could climb. His home was a huge palace with many more rooms than he needed, but probably just enough rooms for all of the children who lived in the valley below. There were children everywhere. They lived all the way from the broken rocks at the foot of the mountain, through the beautiful meadowlands, and on up and into the marsh that bordered the Black River itself. Then the king would have loved to go down to them, but he couldn't. He was quite simply too big. The sides of the mountain could not have supported his weight, so he had to stay at the top. The children were much too small to make the climb, so they had to stay at the bottom. But every day, the great king would stand at the parapet wall with his hands resting on the blocks and watch the children play and wish that he was with them. One morning, he saw a little girl dancing in a meadow, and there were some boys playing tag, and a very lively mud ball fight starting in the marsh. But there was something coming across the river. A long boat pulled by a tall figure in a dark hooded cloak. As he came out of the mists and the shadows, the ruler of the dark domain looked right up and into the eyes of the great king, and he said, "I've come." The great king squeezed his hands on the blocks very hard. When the ruler of the dark domain got all the way over to the bank of the river and scudded up onto the mud, he said in his pleasantest voice, "Come, children, get into my boat. We'll go across to the other side where there are games and toys and food and fun and grass to play on and sunshine and ice cream. All the ice cream you want. And I promise, if you don't like it, I'll bring you back myself. Trust me." Just like that, 30 children climbed into the boat with happy smiles on their faces and dreams and visions of fun. And the ruler of the dark domain pulled his boat away from the light side of the river and closer to the mists and shadows and all the way across. But first, right before he disappeared into the shadows, he turned. "I've won. Don't you just hate me?" The boat hit the other side of the river. Most of the children fell down. They tossed it off, thought it was a lot of fun. And when they struck that bank, all of the children jumped out of the boat and ran in every different direction. Why? Because they couldn't see where they were going. There is no light in the dark domain. That's why it's called that. And they were looking for the food and the funs and the games and the toys and the sunshine and the grass to play on. But the ruler of the dark domain watched each face for any sign of confusion or fear. And he saw it. And he laughed every time. The children had no guide on which way to go but the sound of his voice, and there was no light. So one by one they all came closer and closer to the ruler of the dark domain. Finally they all stood around him in a semicircle. One little boy said, "Sir, is this a cloud that's keeping the sun away, and will it blow away?" And the deceiver laughed. A little girl came and said, "Sir, I've taken my shoes off so I can feel the grass in my toes. All I feel is mud. Is there a nicer place? And the deceiver laughed again. One little girl came and she was very bold. She said, all right, where's the ice cream? Ice cream. There is no ice cream, no food, no fun, no sunshine, no games, no toys. Ice cream! You belong to me! And he grabbed the little girl and a little boy next to her. And they screamed, which frightened the other children, so they ran away. But they did not get far because they could not see. And one by one, the deceiver caught them all and he put a clasp on their ankles. He ran a chain through it. He put a lock to it. In no time at all, he had all 30 children caught. And then he unhooked a whip from his belt and he said, now, march. No, the great king whispered. And the stones began to chip and flake. No, the great king said. And the stones began to crack. No! The great king roared, and the stones exploded, and rocks and chips and dust fell away to the valley below. He turned slowly and made his way for the throne. All of the attendants got out of the way just as fast as they could, and they made no noise, so they did not want to disturb their master. He got to his throne, and he sat down. Opening his hands, the rocks and the chips and the dust fell out, and he said, I want my son. 40 attendants ran just as fast as ever they could to do the great king's bidding. 3 of them bounced off of the crown prince as he came in from the west parapet. And they fell all over the floor, and he picked them up, and he dusted them off. He's very polite. He apologized a good deal, and then he said, Father, we have to do something. I've been watching. The ruler of the dark domain came over. He took 30 children. He promised them everything. He lied to them, Father. He took them into the dark domain. He's got them on chains. Father is beating them with a whip. We have to do something now. And the great king, even though he felt so sorry about the children, he smiled a little smile because, you know, they'd always been this way. If one of them was unhappy, so was the other one. And if one of them was laughing in the great hall, the other was probably giggling in the kitchen. And the great king said, I know. I have to send them someone strong, someone true, someone noble. But the only someone I have like that, the only someone I have to send is you. The crown prince said, perfect. I can go. I can climb down the mountain. You can't. You're too big. But you're not fat. I can climb down the mountain. I can cross the Black River. I can go into the dark domain. I can bring the children back. I'll do it, Father. And he turned and he started to run. And in a few more steps, he was going to launch himself, go to the top of the wall, sit, turn, and start down the other side. You could see it. And the great king said, wait! The crown prince said, yes, Father? The great king said, do you know what will happen as you descend? Yes, Father. I'll become smaller, no bigger than a child. The great king took his sword belt off, carried his sword belt and scabbard to the crown prince. He said, you're going to need this. The crown prince said, oh, Father, I'm going to get very little. The sword is very big. Is it going to change size? No. And the great king was already getting very sad about the whole thing. The crown prince said, Father, are you sure I'll need it? Yes, trust me. All right, I will. The great king wrapped the sword belt around his son, clasped it very tight, and he looked at his son and he said, I love you. And in his mind he was thinking, what a fine-looking boy. And he was right. Oh, the crown prince was 6'5" tall, had a dimple in his chin, high cheekbones, nice hair, very strong, very handsome. The crown prince said, I love you too, Dad. I've got to go. He turned in only 2 steps. He launched himself to the top of the wall and sat, started to swing his legs over, and he stopped. He took his crown off very carefully, put it on the top of the wall, right next to the part that his father had ruined. He said, "Goodbye, Father." Swung his legs over and he started down. And it was true. With every inch, the crown prince climbed down the mountain. He became smaller in stature and weaker in frame, until a quarter of the way down the mountain, he looked no bigger than 15. He had to tighten the belt around his waist. Halfway down the mountain, he looked no older than 10. The sword belt slipped to his feet. He stepped out of it and put his arm and his head through it and hung up and down on his back. Nearly at the bottom, he looked no older than 5 years old. And he was having an awful time with that sword, since it was much taller than he was by this time. And there were dozens of children at the bottom of the mountain, standing among the broken rocks, and they were arguing. Some said that they'd seen him come all the way down from the top, and they thought he'd gotten smaller as he came down. They suggested that he might be the crown prince, but others said, no, he's not the crown prince. I only saw him come from about halfway up. So he's just a child like you and me, but what a nice sword, eh? And the bullies came up and they said that he wasn't the crown prince, he hadn't come down from the top, and he was a liar and a cheat. He stole that sword, they said. The crown prince listened to it all, and very congenially stepped up and said, "I'm the crown prince." And they laughed at him. One bully winked at another. That bully ran around all of the children till he was right behind the crown prince. With another wink, the second bully got down on his hands and knees very quietly behind the crown prince. And then the bully in front, the leader, said, "So, you're the crown prince?" "Yes," said the prince, "and my father sent me to tell you." But the bully interrupted him because he said, "You're a liar," and pushed him. The crown prince fell over the back of the bully behind him and landed on the rocks with a thud. He got up slowly, he dusted himself off. And he walked right up to the bully and he said, "My father's the great king. I'm the crown prince. I don't lie, I don't cheat, I don't steal, and I don't hurt people. You're very lucky." "My father sent me here to tell you not to get in the boat because he wants you to come and live with him forever." "He does." And the bullies backed away. Oh, they tried to look very gruff, putting that look on their faces. Well, it didn't look very genuine at all. And the other children were all getting very, very interested in whatever the crown prince had to say. And the bullies had to go to the back of the line, to the back of the group, and whisper, because the other children kept turning around and saying, "Shh." The bullies didn't like that at all. And the crown prince went around for the rest of the day and he told all of the children about his father, the great king, and that his father wanted them to come and live with him and not to get in the boat. Because if you got in the boat, you'd go somewhere you didn't want to go and you couldn't come back. So don't get in the boat. It made sense. A lot of the children listened to him. But by the end of the day, there were 3 or 4 little girls and about a dozen little boys who had decided this child was really something special. And they wanted to be with him. And they all stayed up late into the night and they talked and talked and talked, but not the crown prince. He was very tired. He curled up and he went to sleep. So he got a lot more sleep than the other children. He woke up the next morning and he stretched. And as he sat up, he was smiling. He'd been dreaming. He had dreamt of the time when he heard his father's laughing. His father was laughing so hard out on the parapet wall, and the crown prince went out to him, and his father was actually sitting on the floor of the parapet, laughing. And the crown prince said, "What's so funny?" It took a while because the great king was laughing so hard. But he said that he had seen a little boy come up and slip a frog down the back of a little girl's shirt. And the little girl got very upset about it. And she went away in a huff, and the little boy forgot all about it, but the little girl didn't forget about a thing. She went straightway down to the marsh. She gathered a lot of black, gooey mud, and she wrapped it up in a fig leaf. And then she came back, and the little boy said, "What's that you've got there?" And with a little smile, she said, "A lot better home for your frog than the back of my shirt." And she slapped him with it right in the face. He helped his father up. He remembered that. And he laughed for a very long time. He remembered that. And then he was wishing that he were home. He woke the other children up and said, "I have to go. Come on, come on. I have to go to the river today. Come on, wake up." And the other children started to wake up, but they also started to wonder, just what is the Crown Prince going to do at the river today? One of them said, "Oh, I know. You're going to take that sword and you're going to cut the deceiver into little bitty pieces." It'll be just pieces of deceiver all over the place. The Crown Prince said, "Oh, gross. That's not what my father sent me for." Another one said, I know. Ask me, I know. What? You're going to take that sword and you're going to cut the boat in two and the deceiver will have to swim home. And the children smiled. And the Crown Prince said, "No, that's not what my father sent me for." "Well," said one of the boys, "what did your father send you for? What are you going to do at the river?" The Crown Prince looked down and he thought. Then he looked up to the top of the mountain and he thought. And he said, I'm going to get in the boat and I'm going to cross the river. And one of them said, "Oh, you're going to, you can't, because you told everybody, you told us, you told me, you told all of it, you even told the bullies. You said, don't get in the boat. You said, don't get in the boat. My father wants you to live with him, but you told everybody, you told us. You can't do it. Because we love you." And the Crown Prince said very slowly, "I have to. My father and I have talked it over, and it's the best thing to do. It's what is right. You can come down to the river, but you can't get in the boat. I have to leave now." He stood up and he started down the road. And the children started in very slowly and did follow him. Word spread very quickly all through the broken rocks and the meadowlands and the marsh. All of the children heard that the little boy with the sword was going away. He was going to get in the boat, and they thought that was silly. He told them not to. And all of the other children gathered on the riverbanks, and the riverbanks were full. But the Crown Prince did not stop to talk about it. He just kept on walking until he was right up to the river's edge. And he stood there waiting. One of the children, far up the river, pointed and screamed and said, "There he is!" and pointed straight at the ruler of the dark domain as he came out of the mists and the shadows, straight towards the Crown Prince. Halfway across, the ruler started laughing again. You've come. Good. Because now you have to get in my boat. And I'll tell you why. Because if you don't get in my boat, I'm taking all of these children with me, and you'll never see them again. And I'll still win. The Crown Prince said, "I don't have to get in the boat." "Yes, you do." "No, I don't." The ruler of the dark domain unhooked his whip and said, "I command you." The Crown Prince said, "Oh, I'll get in the boat, but not because of anything you say. My father and I have already talked it over, and we know it's the best thing to do. That's why I've come." And the ruler of the dark domain said, "Then your father is a fool." Oh, I shouldn't say that if I were you. And then the Crown Prince stepped into the boat, he got the sword out of the way, he sat down. He looked back at all of the children. He gave them a little wave as the boat began to go. There was no warning when the boat reached the other side of the river. Oh, the ruler of the Dark Domain knew that it was about to hit, but he didn't shout out a warning at all. He flexed his knees to absorb the shock, but the Crown Prince went flying forward in the boat and hurt his head on one of the pieces of wood. The ruler of the Dark Domain said in mocking tones, "Welcome to my kingdom, Your Majesty. Let me help you ashore." And he threw him from the boat. Jumped out, picked him up, launched him up under one arm, and ran through the darkness to the sound of crying children. When he caught up to the children, he stopped them with one pull on the chain. He threw the Crown Prince down in the mud, put a clasp around his ankle. He started the chain through. He put a lock on it. Then he backed away several feet, and he unhooked his whip, and he uncoiled it, and he said, "Let me make you comfortable, Crown Prince." But you know, that stroke did not touch the Crown Prince's back. It hit the scabbard. And the ruler of the Dark Domain hissed a couple of curses, and he tried it again. But that stroke didn't touch his back either. It hit the scabbard. Oh, he was mad now. And spluttering curses and hissing a good deal, he stomped through the mud, and he got up to the Crown Prince, and he rubbed both hands, all of his fingers, right around the handle of the sword. And then he decided that was not such a good idea after all. The handle of the sword was hot, and it was getting hotter the harder he tried to let go. He found out he could not let go. His hand seemed to be stuck. There was the stench of something burning and pulling with every ounce of his strength. He pulled, trying just to release his hands from the handle, but the sword blade slid out of the scabbard. And when it did, the sword got even hotter, and the ruler of the Dark Domain's hands burst into flame, and his sleeves caught on fire, and he screamed, "Ah! Ah! Ah!" Frightening, isn't it? He threw the sword just as fast, just as hard, and just as far away from as he could. As it departed the Dark Domain, the darkness re-entered the land. As he threw, and it separated from his hands, it carried some of him with him. And as the sword sliced through the air on its way back across the river and toward a very large window, it blazed, it shined, it shone. For a few moments, it had lit up the entire Dark Domain. But it had suffered a far greater hurt than the ruler of the Dark Domain. It was pure and it was perfect, and it had been touched by something vile, and it screamed a shriek of its own. On it flew upward and through the west window and sunk, point first, 1.5 feet into the floor of the great hall. And the great king rose, and he walked to it, and he reached one finger for the handle of the sword. He touched the hilt, and the entire sword blazed brilliantly for a few seconds, and then went cold and gray as a stone. Ashes fell from the handle, and the attendants were very quick to sweep them up and to wipe down the sword. The great king watched it all, and then he turned and he came back to his throne and he sat down. And one tear came coursing down his giant cheek as he thought about his wonderful son. And in his heart he could feel each bite of the whip. He could sense each sickening fear. There were 100 ways he could have saved his son, but only one way was right. Only one way would work. Only one way was both a rescue and a victory. And he had to wait. Oh, and it pained him. On the morning of the third day, try as he might, the deceiver could only hit the little boy 2 times with his whip. The first stroke wrapped around his little body. And with one pull, the deceiver threw the little boy to the ground. At that moment, the great king was already walking towards the sword. He pulled it easily out of the stone floor, and he walked to the parapet wall. He lifted the sword high over his head, and he said, "For my son and for the children." It didn't shriek this time. It sang a sweet crystalline song. As it hurried on its way to the darkness, it was ready for a battle. The second stroke that struck the prince cut deep, and now the prince was bleeding. He gasped for breath. He shut his eyes very tight. And when his arms gave way, he fell face forward in the mud. He thought, I can't do nothing. Nothing more. And his lungs exhaled. And his great little heart stopped beating. And all of the dark domain was very quiet for just a few moments. And then it broke. I've won. I've won. I will rule the lower lands. I will conquer each child. And there is nothing the great king can do. He is powerless. You are powerless to stop me. You can't touch me now. And he laughed. But he didn't know what was happening from across the river. The darkness had made it stand halfway across the river. But the sword was falling faster now than when the king had thrown it. And it sang that sweet crystalline song. Really, it was just one note, but it was pure. And it vibrated, and it made that sound, and it shone. And it was eager to do its work, and it struck the darkness, and it cut it right in two. From sky to earth, it was rent, and it flapped like dirty sheets. And the sword tumbled faster and faster, and it filled the dark domain with a sound as pure and lovely and loud as the sword was already bright and hot. And it tumbled and it whirled and it fell, and the deceiver shut his eyes, and all he could do was back away, try to keep out of the way, and bow his head the closer it came, because it was so bright. And the sword fell, sunk 6 inches deep through a link of the chain halfway between the crown prince and the little girl in front of him. The power of the sword sizzled against the links until they all began to glow, and each one vibrated. The chains, the links, the clasps, the locks, until they were all vibrating and glowing, and suddenly they just gave up and fell into dust. And the great king had thrown that sword so hard that it had created its own wind. And a mighty wind, a fierce wind, fell down from the mountain, blew the dust away. Something had happened to the crown prince, because his father's sword had fallen so near. His little heart started beating. His chest inhaled and breathed sweet mountain air. He opened his eyes and they were surprised by the light. It had been quite a while. And he lifted his head and he looked straight at something very strange. His own reflection, but he did not know. All he saw were 2 little eyes and a very muddy-looking face. And the deceiver reared his head and looked through the light, trying to see something, and he saw something, but he did not like it, because there was the crown prince, and he was alive, and not only that, he was reaching for the sword. And he readied his whip for a stroke, and he said, "No, don't touch it!" And he swung for a blow. But whether the Crown Prince heard the ruler of the dark domain or not doesn't really matter. He reached his hand for the sword. And when he touched the vibrating steel, he realized. And he said, "Oh, Father." And he began to grow. He jumped to his feet with the sword in his hand, and the whip just barely missed him. And the deceiver watched, powerless to do anything, as the little boy grew into a man in the course of some 5 seconds. And the mud, it dried very quickly, and it fell away from his face. And there was the dimpled chin. There were the high cheekbones. There was the gleam in his eye. There was the nice hair, a little muddy. And he stood there holding the sword, smiling. But he saw some dark movement behind, so he turned the sword just a little bit to see it a little better in the reflection. And he saw the ruler of the dark domain trying for another blow. He flipped the sword in the air, caught it by its handle, turned, extended his arm, and with a flip of his wrist, cut off a foot of the whip. Do you understand what that whip means to the deceiver? He stood looking at his ruined lash, started hissing, cursing again. And then he exploded like a catapult and tried another whiplash toward the Crown Prince's head, straight at his eye. And if it would have cut, it would have taken an eye out. And he swung, and the Crown Prince calmly stepped aside and cut off a little more whip. Again and again and again, the ruler of the dark domain swung his whip, and again and again and again, the whip met the sword, until finally there was only a little bit of the whip left. About this much. About this much was whip. About this much was handle. It was really not much use. And he stood there hissing as the Crown Prince started to speak. And the Crown Prince smiled. He liked to do that because he knew it made him awfully angry. And the Crown Prince said, "I'm the Crown Prince. My father's the great king. This is his sword. I'm going to be leaving now. I'm taking all of these children with me. My father's expecting us. Oh, you're not invited." The ruler of the dark domain had been standing all this time hissing with his chest 2 inches from the point of the Crown Prince's sword. And then the Crown Prince said what he said, and he gave him another smile, and the day had just not gone the way the deceiver had planned. His chain and his darkness were gone. His whip was ruined. And now the Crown Prince was not only alive, he was very clearly in control. But you know, I think it was the smile that finally pushed him over the edge. He exploded, and he moved forward 2½ inches. The sword had a sense of its own. It decided to do something all on its own. A little bit of power started in the handle and came forward past the hilts. On through the sword it rolled and gained momentum and power. And then at the very tip of the sword, just when there would have been contact between the sword and the ruler of the dark domain, there was an explosion. And it picked up the ruler of the dark domain and it pushed him 15 feet through the air, and he landed with a plop with his seat in the mud. And the children nearby started giggling and pointing, and they whispered down the line. And they described how silly the deceiver looked, sitting on his bottom in the mud and only a skeleton after all, because they could see very clearly. The cowl had been thrown back. That was not a face of flesh, it was only a skull. And a huge hole had been blown in the chest by the point of the Crown Prince's sword. And there was no flesh, there was no blood, there was no skin, no heart, just bits and pieces of broken bone. And soon they were all pointing and laughing, and the deceiver could do nothing. And the Crown Prince stepped forward and he said, "Children, I'm all for getting out of this awful place. Who wants to race me to the river?" Some of the children ran right away, but some of the children stood still. They couldn't imagine leaving the dark domain. They'd been there very long. These were the children who'd been hurt the most. They'd been there the longest. It took them the longest to put one thought together. And none of their thoughts seemed to be very positive. But the Crown Prince said that when he left and took the sword with him, the place would get very dark, so they started moving along. And the Crown Prince looked at the ruler of the dark domain and he said, "Don't bother getting up. I can show myself out. And I want to remember you just as you are." And then he turned, and some of the children still weren't moving very fast. So as he walked, he found and retrieved his scabbard from the mud, put it on and sheathed his sword, and the darkness was creeping up behind. And all the long way to the river, the Crown Prince told the children all about his father and all about his father's home. When he reached the river, some of the children were crying. And he said, "What's the matter?" And they said, "The boat's gone, it's gone, and we can't swim across because it's cold, it's deep, and we can't leave. He'll bring another chain, he'll get another whip." And he said, "You're crying because you can't cross the river?" "Yes." "If I promise you can cross the river, will you stop crying?" "Yes." "Then stop crying. You can cross the river." He said, "Watch this. I read it in a book." And he touched the river with the point of his sword, and it stopped flowing. It did. It built up in a big wall on this side, all the way upriver, and all the way down it was dry as a desert. And the children clapped and hurrahed, and some of them just said, "Wow." And they slid and they stumbled and they climbed and jumped onto the riverbed and ran across as fast as they could. And while they were helping children up on the other bank of the river, the Crown Prince was helping children out of the dark domain. And he had most of them in his arms, and he was sliding down, and the moment they touched their feet to the bottom of the riverbank, the curtain of darkness fell almost with a noticeable sound at the edge of the Black River. When the Crown Prince came across the river with the children, he boosted them up to the other side and he joined them at the top. And he said, "There, you're across the river." And some of them pointed and said, "He's coming, look, he's coming, he's going to get us." The Crown Prince said, "Is it the deceiver?" They said, "Yes." "Will you stop crying if I tell you it will be all right?" "Yes." "It's all right." Then he turned and he looked at the deceiver. And then he made sure all of the children saw his face. And he said, "Children, see the deceiver? He's standing in the middle of the riverbank. Tell me, do you think the deceiver can swim?" It took a little while for them to get the joke. But when they did, they were all laughing. But the ruler of the dark domain didn't get the joke, not until the Crown Prince reached out and touched the point of his sword to the dry riverbed. And then when he did get the sword, when he did get the joke, he didn't think it was very funny. And that wall of water broke, and it cascaded down, and it showered upon him, and picked him up and cast him about like a piece of trash. Yes, a piece of trash. And the children hurrahed, and were very happy, and clapped their hands. And then the Crown Prince said, "My father lives up here, and I'm going up to see him. Who would like to join me?" And some of the children looked very eager. And then they backed away. And he said, "What's the matter?" They said, "Well, you can go up the river, across the river, into the dark domain, down the mountain, up the mountain. You can fight the deceiver. It's because you're big." We're just little. Have a nice time. The Crown Prince said, I know what it's like to be little. And I want you to know what it's like to be up there. Now, it might take me all day, but I can take 3 of you at a time on my back. Now, who wants to go? And that little boy and 2 little girls came forward very fast, and he got down and he said, all right, now put your toes in my belt. There. Grab hold of the collar or the top of the robe, hold very tight, and he climbed up the mountain. And when he got to the top, he wasn't even breathing hard. And he hooked his arm over the parapet wall, and the great king ran forward, and he had that silly look on his face that he got every time he watched the children play. The crown prince had the children on the wall, and the great king reached out and he took one. It was a little girl. And he said, oh, come here. Give me a hug. Come on. Oh, squeeze. Oh, that's good. Oh, come here. Let me help you down. And both of the girls curtsied to him at the same time. And he got that smile on his face that got so big it looked like he might cry. And then he picked up the little boy and he set him down, and the little boy bowed very low to him. And the great king bowed back to him. And he smiled that smile again. And then he said, children, he said, I'm so glad you've come. Now listen, I've got attendants for all of you. They'll take you to your rooms. If you don't like your rooms, you tell us and we'll get you another room. Tell this attendant over here what kind of ice cream you want. All right? And one of the little girls said very sweetly, do you have raspberry fudge? The king said, I don't know, I'll ask him. Do we have raspberry fudge? And the attendant looked very nervous and said, no. And the great king said, he said, no. We're going to, aren't we? The attendant said, yes, Your Highness, raspberry fudge, Your Highness, of course, Your Highness. And all day long, the crown prince brought the children up, put them on the wall, and the great king took them off of the wall, and he told them they could go to the rooms, they could dress however they wanted, the closets were full of clothes, and 2 hours after the bell rang, they'd all have dinner and tell that attendant what kind of ice cream you want. Finally, there were only 2 children left, a little girl and a little boy. And the crown prince had no trouble at all, because only 2 children, he could hurry up the mountain. But these were the 2 that hadn't smiled. Not the whole way. They'd been the first to cross the river in the first place. The crown prince got them on his back. He started up the mountain. He tried every silly joke, every silly face, every silly voice, to no avail, before they would not laugh or smile or chuckle. And he got all the way to the top, and he hooked his arm over the top of the wall. He let the children off his back. He did a little sign language for his father as he came through the door from tasting ice cream. He told his father that these 2 children hadn't smiled all day. The great king seemed to understand, but he was the great king. Everyone knew he loved children. So he hurried. And he was reaching for both of them. He was going to take them off the wall and help them down at the same time, but they shrunk back in fear. And as they sat at the wall, they looked at him with something like the fear they had for the ruler of the dark domain. And the great king said, oh, I'm sorry, I frightened you, didn't I? I forget how big I must seem. Here, let me help you down from the wall. And he moved slower this time. But the children still shrunk back. And the great king was trying to smile, but his eyes looked very sad. And he said, I know. I'll just stand here and you tell me what's wrong. And the little girl started. She said, do you have whips? And the great king said, oh no, honey, we don't allow those up here. I don't like them. And the little boy said, what about chains and locks? Do you have chains? Locks? And the great king said, no, son, We don't have those. The little girl said, the other one said that there was ice cream, but he lied. If he lied, you might lie. Do you lie? And the great king's heart was broken. And he couldn't even look at them, but he said, my son knows me. And you know my son. Why don't you ask him? And they both looked at the crown prince and said at the same time, does he lie? And the crown prince smiled and he said, no. They said, he tells the truth. The crown prince said, always and forever, for he cannot tell a lie. He loves you. The little boy, Adam, said, how do you know that? The crown prince said, do you see that ruined part of the wall over there by the crown? Adam and Eve said, yes. The crown prince said, on the day you were there, the very first day in the dark domain for you, when you were hit with the whip, my father broke that wall. Both of the children looked at each other. They didn't smile, they didn't speak, but they nodded. And then they turned and they reached for the king. He hurried. He picked them up off of the wall. He hugged them tightly. And he said, oh, I'm so glad you've come. I was afraid you wanted to go away. Oh, here. No, I'll take you myself. I'll show you your rooms. All right? And he turned. And he was walking away and he was telling them they could have whatever kind of room they wanted and they could dress however they liked. And 2 hours after the bell rang, they were going to have a wonderful dinner. And he wanted to tell them all of that. And he remembered he'd forgotten something. 2 things. He'd forgotten about the ice cream and he'd forgotten to, what was it? He'd forgotten to thank his son. And he turned and he looked and there was his son, but his son's head was bowed, still holding onto the wall. And his shoulders were heaving. The great king didn't know what was the matter and he didn't want his son to fall, so he put the children down carefully. And he ran to the wall and he lifted his son and he put his feet on the floor of the parapet and he looked at him in the eye after he lifted his chin and he said, it was harder for you than you thought, didn't you? And the crown prince said, well, he tried to say something, but all that came out was, and the great king wrapped him up to his chest, laid his head against his heart, and rocked back and forth. And they were both of them crying, and the great king said, I'm so proud of you, no one else could have done it. And the 2 children, when they started crying, ran like children do when there's a real hug going on. They want to be part of it. So they ran up and they climbed up whatever they could get a hold of, the robes and elbows and shoulders and ears and hair and anything else. They got up to the top and they wrapped their arms around the great king and the crown prince and they hugged them very hard and they were all crying their eyes out and making quite a mess on the floor. And the great king snaked an arm out of all of that mess and he got a handkerchief. And he dried the little girl's eyes. He dried the little boy's eyes. He dried his son's eyes. And then the little girl took the hanky away from him and she dried his eyes. And then he took the hanky away from her and he put it to her nose and he said, blow. And when she did, she sounded like a fine fat goose honking. And they were all still crying, but they were laughing now, and their sides were aching and crying and laughing. And the great king took the children and he backed away a bit and he looked at the crown prince until he got him eye to eye and he said, are you all right? The crown prince said, yes. Yes. It's just been a really hard day. I'm fine. And the great king said, good. Well, where were we? And as he turned to go, he saw, out of the corner of his eye, the crown prince was running towards the wall. The crown prince jumped, launched himself to the top of the wall, sat at the top, reached for the crown, picked it up, rubbed a little bit of shine back into it, put it on his head at a jaunty little angle, And his son said, the great king said to his son, "Where are you going?" The crown prince said, "Well, I'm going down for a bit. I won't be late for dinner. But I've got to tell the children where I've gone. There are a lot of them that listen to me. I've got to tell them where I've gone. And I was wondering, Father, can they come?" The great king said, "Yes, when it's their time, but only if they come with you." The great king said that, and then the crown prince said, "Yes, Father, I'll be back." And down he went. And the great king turned and he said, "Now, where were we?" But the crown prince popped up to the top again. "Father," the great king said, "What? Is something wrong?" "No," said the crown prince, "but that ice cream, I'd like to try raspberry fudge." And the great king said, "Oh, wonderful, I think I'll try it myself." And then he looked at the children and he said, "And what kind of ice cream do you have? I forgot that again." And the children both looked at him and at the crown prince and smiled and said, "Oh, well, we'll have what you're having." And the great king took the children to their rooms, told them they could wear anything they wanted, and then he rang the bell. And 2 hours after the bell was rung, they had a wonderful dinner. And why not? After all, there was the great king, there was the crown prince, there were the children, and the ruler of the dark domain was not invited. That's the great king.